Construction sites are meant to be places of creation, where old spaces are renewed and forgotten places are brought back to life. But what happens when the past refuses to let go? Across the world, there are tales of builders and foremen forced to abandon their jobs. These ordinary people encountered the unexplainable as they unearthed secrets buried beneath the walls, floors, and foundations of places best left untouched. Tonight, I'll share two chilling accounts where renovations took a terrifying turn, where progress came to a screeching halt and crews simply walked away. Hidden in the quiet woods of Lynn, Massachusetts, less than 15 minutes from Salem, yes, that Salem, stands the Chapel House. Built in the 1800s as the residence of a puritanical minister and schoolmaster supposedly devoted to discipline and religious piety. Known for his strict rules and fiery sermons, he was said to have been obsessed with shaping proper behavior of the town's children. But stories hinted at something darker: cruel punishments, secret rituals, and a few children who vanished without a trace. Generations have passed, and with it, its reputation for being haunted has grown as well. With each new restoration, builders discovered Chapel House, in the shadow of Salem's dark history, is far from abandoned. This story comes from Alan, the foreman of a building company who had no idea how bad things would get when he walked into the large Chapel House property in 2019. I made a bid for the restoration of that old house after being approached by its new owners, Margot and Noah. They'd won the property at auction a year prior and wanted a full reno. The money was very good, but I was also super curious about that old place. It had been left to rot for years, and I'd watched the roof sink under the weight of big winter snows. I love old buildings and knew the interior of this one wouldn't disappoint. The couple wanted to keep and refurb as much of the remaining old furniture as possible, so our first task was to clear out what was salvageable. I tasked one of my guys, Rob, with removing a massive old wardrobe with a mirrored door. Rob told me he was shifting the heavy piece from the corner when it shifted and the mirrored door swung open. In the reflection, Rob saw someone behind him, what looked like a man in a black suit, leaning towards him with an arm outstretched. Despite how close he was, Rob said he couldn't see the man's face, like it was misty or cloudy. He said he spun around, but no one was there. He quickly pushed the wardrobe into the hall. Later, another of my guys walked past the mirror in the hall and suddenly ran down the stairs, saying his reflection in the mirror had shown him with hollow black eye sockets and his mouth had been grinning widely. After that, no one would go near it. Margot, determined to keep the wardrobe, insisted it stay put right there in the hallway. The following morning, we came in to find it covered with a white sheet, presumably by Margot. But I found out later that nobody had come to the house after we'd left that night. By the middle of the second week, the crew began work on the chapel-like main hall, where a massive stained glass window dominated one wall. As they removed the damaged plaster, one of the builders, Mark, discovered a curious handprint beneath the layers. A perfect print, as if pressed into the bare stone. But it wasn't a typical print. The fingers were unnaturally long, and the palm seemed stretched. I remember thinking, what kind of a hand does that? Over the next few days, my guys began noticing these long handprints appearing on surfaces they hadn't touched. Dusty windows, on tools, even the inside of their cars parked outside. It's like someone's here, but we can't see them, I heard Rob whisper to no one in particular. I had my own experience with that handprint. I had just walked into the house and felt an icy grip on my shoulder. I turned quickly, expecting to see one of the crew behind me, but the hall was empty. At the end of that second week of renovations, a worker named Jason was up on a ladder plastering the ceiling in one of the bedrooms. Without warning, he felt a rush of freezing water cascade over him, soaking him from head to toe. Flinching, he lost his balance and fell from the ladder. We rushed in after hearing the heavy thud on the hardwood floor. Jason was tapping his chest and touching his arms. Confused and shaken, he insisted he was soaked and could still feel the icy water dripping down his neck. His teeth were even chattering. My crew was unnerved, but they tried to laugh it off, giving Jason hell for being clumsy, until the same thing happened to two other guys in the following days. One of them, Darren, swore he felt a cold splash hit his face while walking through the chapel hall, only to find his skin bone dry. Frustrated and not just a little scared, he said, "This house is definitely messing with us." They did their best to avoid chapel hall for the rest of that day. The basement had been a source of dread for the crew from the start, with its low ceiling, its uneven stone walls, and a pervasive sense of being watched. Nobody wanted to work down there. During the third week, while clearing out old debris, my crew uncovered a locked door hidden behind a stack of rotting old boxes. The lock was rusted, but still intact. With just a little effort, we managed to force it open. This space wasn't on any of the original house plans. Inside was a fully dark, windowless room unlike any other in that house. The air was heavy and damp, and at its center was something terrifying. A rectangular pool cut directly into the earth, stretching almost the entire length of that small room. The dank, inky black water was unnervingly still, and reached almost up to the edge of the dirt floor. Thankfully, Rob turned on his headlamp just before I stepped right into it. Curiosity got the better of us, and we began probing the pool with tools, planks of wood, a crowbar, but we couldn't reach the bottom. One of my guys even dropped a weighted line, only to reel it back in without any trace of mud or sediment, like the pool stretched deep into infinity. That room was colder than the rest of the house, which made no sense because it was only fall and this room was underground. It should have been in the 60s in there, but it felt like a meat locker. Standing near the water gave us an overwhelming sense of vertigo. We looked at each other in silence, somehow knowing we'd disturbed something we didn't want any part of. The guys looked to me for answers, and I tried to be level-headed, saying we'd have to get more info from the owners before we touched anything. As they filed back into the basement through the only door, I was the last to exit, and I felt a sudden desperate panic to leave, like something wanted me to stay. I was the last one, but I didn't feel alone in there. I locked that door behind us and told them to leave the room alone. But that night, I had nightmares of drowning in that basement over and over. I woke up drenched in sweat, cold and unable to catch my breath. Between sleep and waking, my body fought to breathe like I was being repeatedly shoved below the surface. During the last and worst of the dreams, I felt a strong, cold hand pulling at my mouth, stretching my lips open so I'd take in more of that putrid black water. Clawing at the hand, I woke myself up, but not before scratching my own face. I gave up trying to sleep and waited for morning to come. I drove out to that damned house and waited impatiently in my truck for the guys to show. We needed to have a talk. One by one, they got out of their cars looking sleepless like the walking dead. Rob had a deep scratch across his nose that matched the one on my cheek. I told them I didn't think we should finish the job, that the renovations weren't worth the risks, that another job would come along soon. My guys would usually complain about losing hours, but not a soul spoke up. I offered to pay them for the rest of the week. I called the owners right then and there, and when Noah answered, I told him the house wasn't safe. The long silence on the other end, followed by a quiet, "I understand," made me realize they already knew something was in that house. We packed up what was left of our tools and equipment and left Chapel House for good. In 2022, a crew of seasoned Irish builders in County Clare walked off the job of a little Irish cottage after only 3 days, leaving behind their tools and more questions than answers. What happened inside those crumbling walls? This small Irish cottage near the coast in County Clare became the site of some unexplained phenomena that ruffled the local community. The cottage, built in the late 1800s, had been abandoned for decades. Its new owner, Fiona, an ambitious young professional eager to begin working from home, had big plans to modernize it while preserving its rustic charm. She hired a team of experienced builders to carry out the work. But just 3 days into the job, the entire crew quit, refusing to return. Here's what happened, as told by the foreman, Nick. The crew began by tearing out the old, crumbling plaster in the main living area. It was hard work, dusty and slow going. It was mid-afternoon when Ryan, one of my younger workers, called me over. "Do you hear that?" Ryan asked, his face pale. I paused, wiping the sweat and dust from my face, and listened towards the wall where he was working. At first, I thought it was the sound of settling wood or the wind whistling through the cracks in the walls. But as we stood there in silence, the entire crew got quiet, and we all heard it. A faint, muffled conversation. But none of us were speaking. "It's just echoes," I said, trying to reassure my crew. But the voices didn't stop. They grew louder, clearer. It wasn't in English or Irish, just a low, murmuring conversation that seemed to lilt and move along the walls. My men searched the room, looking for a radio or even checking the driveway to see if someone was outside. But they found nothing. The sounds came and went all day. They'd stop, and as soon as we'd move on and nearly forget about them, they'd start again. By the time they clocked out that evening, more than one of the lads swore they heard laughter following them to their cars. On the second day, my electrician Kieran joined us and headed up to start running wires in the attic, where Fiona had a loft office planned. It was a cramped and dusty space that hadn't been touched in decades. About an hour later, Kieran came rushing down the ladder, his face ashen and his hands trembling. "I'm not going back up there," he said, still clutching his tool bag. Exasperated, I asked him what the hell had happened. I needed him to finish in the attic as soon as possible. I can still hardly believe what he said next. Kieran is not a young man prone to foolishness. I'd worked with him for years and knew the man well. He was someone I trusted to be level-headed and dependable. Turning to keep a watchful eye on the ladder leading to the attic, he told me how he was setting up to run wires along the beams when he felt like someone was watching him. At first, he looked about and saw he was alone, until his eyes landed on something in the shadow at the far end of the attic. There was something crouched low to the ground, staring at him with glowing blue eyes. When he turned to face it, the figure slinked back into the shadows and crawled up the wall and seemed to disappear into the ceiling. But as he scrambled to grab his kit and leave, the ladder had violently shaken under him, nearly throwing him to the ground. I'd never seen Kieran in such a state. He left the house without another word, and I watched in utter disbelief as his car disappeared down the road. On the third and final day, my team was working in the kitchen, hoping to avoid whatever strange energy seemed to haunt the rest of the house. But this plan quickly fell apart. Just before lunch, Daniel was working on demoing the wall around the hearth, where there'd been damp creeping in around the chimney. As he was removing the old tiles encircling the hearth, he uncovered a rusted iron box buried in the wall. It was heavy and had a heavy chain wrapped around it. I watched him as he set it down on the ground. We were all curious and watched him pull the chain off and open the creaky lid. Inside was a small bundle of charred, burned, brittle bones, but not those of an animal. The realization that these were likely human bones from a small person or child made us go silent. And as soon as the box was opened, a blood-curdling scream filled the room. It was high-pitched like a woman's scream, but it didn't sound human. It echoed through the cottage, loud and piercing, then stopped abruptly. My men stood frozen, slack-jawed, staring at one another, until I finally said, "That's it, lads. Pack it up. We're done." I tried calling Fiona, but her voicemail was full. I left a note on the door. "The place is cursed. Don't call us again." I returned the deposit she'd given me, but she never returned my calls. I heard she'd tried to hire another crew, but word had already spread. No one in the area would touch the job. It's been 2 years, and it's still empty, just like we left it. I heard even the kids won't go up there to snoop around. Not after hearing the whispers and screams themselves in the dead of night. When we tear into the past, we often find more than we bargained for. Not every house wants to be restored, and not every story is meant to be rewritten. So the next time you pass a half-finished project or an abandoned site, ask yourself, did the builders leave because they chose to, or because they had no choice? Sleep well, and may your walls remain silent.